Well, good evening, Eastside Community Church. Thank you guys for joining in. We are beginning our studies again, Daniel chapter 11, and we're going to be looking at most of 11. We'll go throughout it. One of the things I want to do is um, I'll read to you the verses. Some of it I might just highlight and not get in detail because what happens in chapter 11 is a lot of information that I've given in the previous chapters. And I'll point that out to you. Maybe in a little bit more detail of what it talks about. When you start looking at some of these kings it talks about from the Alexandrian era of rule of Greece and some of the interconflict that they have with each other. You'll see like this king from the north, king from the south. But it's still basically going to be a lot of the same stuff. It's been said that in this one chapter alone, from this point on, there is, I believe, somewhere around 175 fulfilled prophecies. And that very well is true because this whole thing, up until you get to verse 35, is all history that has taken place. And so we're going to look through this, we'll read through it, we'll make notes where we need to make notes. We'll try to, and hopefully get to, and spend most of our time at the prophecy portion of this book, of this chapter, because that's what really is not necessarily pertinent for us, but is probably more beneficial in the sense that we haven't really seen a lot of the predicted Antichrist in detail like it's going to be here. We've seen him hinted at, but in here it's a greater detail. So appreciate everybody showing up, for coming out, for listening to our recording. Um, and we're starting it back up. So thank you for that. We want to pray for you. We want to pray for your peace and well-being, but also for the peace and well-being of the people in our community and the church and everything else. So before we get into this, let us pray, and then we will get into the message. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for everything that you've done. We just ask right now that you'll be with our church, our community, the people that are involved at our church, and other things, and that you will show us how you would um, uh, like us to live on a daily basis, how we spend time with you. We pray for our study now in Daniel that you will bless it. It's Daniel chapter 11. We're closing in on this book. We've been going through this book for the last 10 weeks, Father. And so we ask that you'll just continue to watch over us and guide us and direct us as we speak and talk. It's in your name we pray. Amen. So as we look here, one of the things I want to note is if you open up to Daniel 11:1, most people, would agree that verse 1 of chapter 11 coincides with the last chapter. First year of Darius the Mede, I believe that's around 538 BC, somewhere around there. But it would coincide with chapter 10, that first verse. Why it got put here, I don't know. Why it's here, how it got separated like this. It's whoever put the separations in the Bible decided to ended here, but most people would agree that this points back to 10:21, that it's a continuation of all that. Darius the Mede, he came into power in 539, 538 BC. So this is when this particular thing would take place. Because when we get into the prophecy that we're going to look at is concerning Cyrus, who was a earlier king, and I'll explain that in a second. But just note, this first year is referring back to the previous chapter, and he says, "Now the angel says, now I tell you the truth." And and here's the truth that he gives: three more kings will arise in Persia, and the fourth will be far richer than the others. Now, if you're to look at it, four more kings didn't appear after Darius. It is, from all intensive standpoints, it is talking about Cyrus and the kings that come on later. And if you look at it and you read through it, you've got Darius, you've got a couple other kings, but the fourth one will be the most successful one. The fourth one will be richer than the others. He'll have more success. By the power he gains through his riches, he'll stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Now, who is this fourth king? Well, it's none other than Xerxes. Xerxes. It's the king that by far the richest of the Persians. Militarily, he attacked Greece. He stirred up Greece, and he stirred up a hornet's nest at some point because in verse 4 you're going to see what happens. Alexander comes about because of it. But Xerxes is the obvious person that's being talked about in um, verse number 2 here. So you'd have Cyrus, you'd have Darius, you'd have, just trying to think through all of the kings there, you'd have Xerxes, and I'm missing one for sure, and I'm trying to think of his name off the top of my head. But those would be the kings that would be taking place following the four kings. And so when you get into this, it describes, then a warrior king will arise and he will rule a vast realm and do whatever he wants in verse 3. So in verse 3, we have the introduction, which most people would agree, as Alexander the Great. This is Alexander the Great coming in and coming into. Sorry, I'm looking up. I just realized I was looking up. I have one of my Bibles that I'm reading up there. Um, but in verse 3, it's obviously Alexander the Great. It's Alexander the Great that's coming up. He's the ruling warrior king that is rising up. We've discussed him so much. I don't want to get in detail about him, but he's the one that rises up. And it says he does whatever he wants, and he does. He rises to power. We've talked about him. But as soon as he's established, which we saw this, his kingdom will be broken. That means he dies, and that four kings will come up. And it says that it will be broken in verse 4 up and divided into the four winds of heaven. The four kings, the four winds of heaven, means throughout in all directions of the earth that his dynasty will be split up. And I listed them to you: Seleucid, Ptolemy, Cassander, and I think I've already mentioned Ptolemy. But I gave all those information before, and so I don't want to get bogged down in all that. But just know this is a kind of a repetition of it, but not to his descendants, and that's because two of his children, his two children that he did have, died before he died, and so they never became kings. And it will not be the same kingdom that he ruled, meaning it's going to be divided up between four. They won't have the power that he had. They will rule differently because his kingdom will be uprooted and will go to the others besides them, and that's the kings, or the four kings. And then in verse 5 it says kings of the south. It talks about the kings of the south. And so let's look at these kings of the south real quick and see about these guys. These kings of the south, it says, sorry, the kings of the south will grow powerful, but one of his commanders will grow more powerful and rule with a great kingdom greater than his. So we're talking about Ptolemy and his dominance. It's a recount of his dominance and his king's dominance. He's the king of the south. It's a reference to the rule over Egypt at the time. Egypt is south. North, will be, uh, everything was, when you look at Israel, south and north of Israel. That's what you got to think because that's the center stage for all this. And so it's Ptolemy's rule in Egypt. He's the king of the south, and he was one of the generals under Alexander, and his commanders keep ruling and ruling after him. But it talks about him, and his commanders will grow more powerful and rule a kingdom greater than his. And then after some years, they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to seal the agreement. She will not retain power, and his strength will not endure. She will be given up together with her entourage, her father, and the one who supported her during those times. So when we look at it, there's conflicts that happen between the kings of the south, kings of the north, which would be the Seleucid dynasty. And, from the beginning of these conflicts between the kingdoms here, between Ptolemy and Seleucid, and you go on, the clashes continued under, Ptolemy the second. And when we look at it, it goes even to further than that. Finally, Ptolemy II, makes this treaty of peace with the Seleucid ruler Antiochus II. At the time, that's not our Antiochus, I don't believe, that we're wanting to look at. Um, but he makes a peace offering with Antiochus around 250 BC, and it's this alliance that verse 6 is referring to. Actually, I take that back. Looking at the dates on it, it is our Antiochus. But under the terms of this agreement, Bernice, Ptolemy's daughter, the one that's going to go to the king of the south, was married to Antiochus, the king of the north, seals this alliance between these two kingdoms. Her son was then to become heir of the Seleucid throne. However, Antiochus was already married to a powerful and influential woman already named Laodice, who succeeded in murdering Antiochus, Bernice, and their child. So their power didn't last. And then Laodice then ruled as queen and regent during the minority of her son Seleucid's rule. Verse 7, it says, "In the place of the king of the south, one from her family will rise up, come against the army, and enter the fortress of the king of the north. He'll take action against them in triumph." So, one uh, of Berenice's family line, it points to her brother, um, Ptolemy the third, who ends up succeeding his father, Philadelphus, to the throne of Egypt to take her place, literally in his place. And it's when we look at it, when you look at the rule and the relationship that they have, it's during the course of this verse that Ptolemy, captured and looted the Seleucid capital of Antioch at that time. And the Egyptian king soundly defeated the Syrians' forces and evidently put the evil Laodice to death. So all this is taking place. It's just these wars that are happening between the Ptolemy dynasty and the Seleucid dynasty. It says in verse 8, "He will take even their gods captive to Egypt, with their metal images and their precious articles of silver and gold." It's basically him stealing, taking them after he rules, and for some years he will stay away from the king of the north. That means he's going to leave them alone. Ptolemy seized the Syrian gods, and other valuables. He returned them to Egypt's treasury, and he included all the sacred idols that they had, and he had taken them, by the Persian monarch, uh, and 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 took them down. And Ptolemy made this peace treaty in 240 BC with Seleucus. We saw that. And that's why the king of the north stayed away. Verse 9: Who will enter kingdom of the king of the south and then return to his own land? And again, that's just the going back and forth between them. It appears that Seleucid very briefly tries to attack and then does not fight for too long, but rather comes back. We don't really have a record of Seleucid ever doing that, um, but whatever it was something swift and brief and made him retreat. Verse 10: His sons, speaking of the king of the king again, his sons will mobilize for war and assemble a large number of armed forces. They will advance, sweeping through like a flood, and will again wage war as far as his fortress. So, verse 10, we're looking at it. Um, when we look at it, we need to know that Seleucus II died in 226 BC, but his son Seleucus III is in power, and then Antiochus III, which is the one that we're really concerned with. It wasn't the second, it's the third, and the dates on him are 237 to 187. They continued the wars, and rather than with everything that's going on with Ptolemy and Seleucid, when they were murdered after a brief 3-year reign, his brother Antiochus III comes into power. He was called the Great because of his military success, and he's going to be the Great One. And he campaigned in Phoenicia and Palestine, part of Ptolemy's empire. He's going everywhere, succeeding and taking over wherever he can. And it talks about him advancing, sweeping through like a flood, and will wage war as far as his fortress, and that's Antiochus III doing all this. In verse 11, infuriated, the king of the south will march out to fight the king of the north, who will raise a large army, but they will be handed over to his enemy. So in response, Ptolemy launches a counterattack. Ptolemy the Fourth, that is, launches a counterattack. Both armies quite large. Both armies capable of fighting, and winning military campaigns. But Ptolemy's forces consisted of about 70,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, 73 elephants, and Antiochus' army had 62,000 infantry, about 6,000 cavalry, and 102 elephants. He used elephants in battles back then, at least in that era. And the battle ended around 217 BC. Ptolemy won the victory of the Syrians at that point in time. Verse 12, it says, when the army is carried off, he will become arrogant and cause tens of thousands to fall, but will not triumph. Because of this victory, Ptolemy's heart was filled with pride, and the Egyptian army slaughtered many thousands of the Syrian troops in battle. It's been reported that Antiochus lost 17,000 soldiers, yet Ptolemy and his supremacy was not to continue. So he ends up dying or being removed. Verse 13. The king of the north will again raise a multitude larger than the first. After some years, he'll advance with a great army and many supplies. So it's here that we see um, Antiochus, about 15 years later, invade the Ptolemy Empire, the territories, with a bigger army. And the occasion for this invasion was the death of Ptolemy the Fourth. So he dies, so he invades. He tries to take over. They crowned his young son as king, and Antiochus comes in. And he took full advantage of the opportunity, attacked it, and and by 201 BC, he um, takes over. The Gaza fortress is taken over. So in verse 14, we have, in those times, many will rise up against the kings of the south. Violent ones among your own people will assert themselves to fulfill a vision, but they will fail. You know, the people that are opposing the king of Egypt, you know, being people like Philip the Fifth of Macedon, allies of Antiochus and native insurrectionists of Egypt, eventually these people overtake the Ptolemy Empire. Antiochus only did so much, but these other people end up taking it over. And then you have the Israelites who rebelled against the Egypts in fulfilling this the vision as well. Verse 15, then the king of the north will come, build up a siege and ramp, and capture a well fortified city. The forces of the south will not stand, and even the select troops will not be able to resist. That's the ultimate downfall of the south, of the country of Egypt. General Scopas engaged the Syrian forces at the Battle of Panium near, you know, Caesarea Philippi, in 199 BC and suffered severe losses. He then retreated to Sidon, to the Phoenician coast, and Antiochus' forces pursued the Egyptians and besieged Sidon. And General Scopas finally surrendered in 198, and so here it is, the fall of the southern army. 1116. The king of the north who comes against him will do whatever he wants, and no one will oppose him. He will establish himself in the beautiful land with total destruction in his hand. And when it says the beautiful land, he is referring to Israel. So this is Antiochus coming in. He comes in to the beautiful land of Israel, and no one will oppose him. He'll establish himself there. Total destruction in his hand. With the defeat of the Egyptians at Sidon, Antiochus has acquired complete control over the whole area that has taken place. The beautiful land, Palestine, Israel. It's referred to as Palestine, but it's what we would look at as Israel, is the permanent possession of the Syrian Empire now. It's important because it sets the stage for the reign of terror to follow under the Syrian Greek ruler Antiochus the Fourth Epimanes. Or, yeah, Epimanes is what the Jews called him, Epiphanes, Antiochus Epiphanes. And so we see that take place in these verses. It says in verse 17, he'll resolve to come with the forces of his whole kingdom and will reach an agreement with him. He will give him a daughter in marriage and destroy it, but will stand with him to support it. Then he'll turn around his attention to the coast and the islands and capture many, but a commander will put an end to his taunting instead, and he will turn his taunts against him. He will turn his attention back to the fortress of his own land, but he will stumble and fall and be no more. And that's the end of Antiochus. You see how Antiochus goes to and fro, taking over whatever he can, and is finally put to an end. After a humiliating defeat, Antiochus returned to his country where he was killed by an angry mob in 187 BC, in desperate needs of funds, particularly those required to meet the payments to Rome. The Syrian ruler pillared the temple of Zeus and was killed in the process. So the citizens of that area defended their sanctuary and killed him. You just keep going on. Verse 20. In his place one will arise, who will send out a tax collector for the glory of the kingdom, but within a few days he will be broken through, not in anger and battle. The son of the successor of Antiochus, in verse here, was Seleucid the fourth Philanthropist, who sent out a tax collector named Heliodorus to collect the money to pay the thousands of talents and indemnity demanded annually by the Romans as part of the treaty that they made. Seleucus even sent out this man to plunder the temple in Jerusalem in order to provide funds to the Syrian treasury. But a frightful vision of the mighty angels prevented this sacrilege. It's just, a continuation of all these things that are taking place. And so if you really want to see history in detail, you just read through these verses just like what we're doing, and do it with a commentary or something to provide you context with the history, or a history book even, and you just see it unravel. Verse 23, after an alliance is made with him, he will act deceitfully. He will rise to power with a small nation. This is the other king here in verse 22 that we see. In 169 BC, we see that Ptolemy the fourth launched an attack to regain territories in Palestine and Phoenicia that was lost to the Syrians. But his overwhelming army was defeated by, the the forces that he came against. Ptolemy was even captured and defeated. He was never killed, but he was held hostage by the Seleucid king. And that goes all the way to 26 and 27. With a large army, he will stir up power and his courage against the king of the south. The king of the south will be prepared for battle and with an extremely large and powerful army, but he will not succeed because plots will be made against him. Those who eat his provisions will destroy him. His armies will be swept away, and many will fallen slain. The two kings whose hearts are bent on evil will speak lies at the same table, but to no avail, for still the end will come at the appointed time. This refers back, this section, to Antiochus' first campaign in Egypt in 169. So you see, it's just going back and forth in history even. And you just see history just written right on the pages. Verse 27, while Ptolemy the sixth was a prisoner, Ptolemy the seventh was made king. You're getting into Ptolemy's the dynasty's latter rulers now. And then verse 28, it says, the king of the north will return to his land with great wealth, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant, and he will take action, then return to his own land. And in this verse, Gabriel arrives at the real purpose of all this historical data, to set the stage for the persecution of the Jewish people. That's what this is referring to, the Holy Covenant. Antiochus' successful first campaign against Egypt is the background for verse 28 after the plundering of Egypt. And the king returns home by way of Palestine. He found an insurrection in the progress. He put down the rebellion, massacring 80,000 men, women, and children, and then looted the temple with the help of the evil high priest Menelaus. And the persecution of the Jews by this man, Antiochus, had now escalated. So it just, you see it go on and on with the persecution of the Jews now and under Antiochus. At the appointed time, he will come again to the south, but this time will not be like the first. Ships of Kittim will come against him, and being intimidated, he will withdraw. And then he'll rage against the Holy Covenant to take action. On his return, he'll favor those who abandon the Holy Covenant. Antiochus invades Egypt again, but this time he's not successful. Records that the cause of Antiochus' failure was the encountered opposition from the ships of the western coastal lands. Kittim is the ancient name for Cyprus. That came to be used of the lands in the Mediterranean in general. And here it refers to these Roman fleets that had come to Alexandria at the request of the Ptolemies. That the Fourth Empire, which would eventually defeat the Third Greece, is introduced, and that would be Rome. Let's see, and that's up to 30. His forces in 31 will rise up and desecrate the temple fortress. They will abolish the regular sacrifices and set up the abomination of desolation. That's where we talked about Antiochus coming in and kicking out the people of the temple, and bloodying it up with the pig, and splashing the altar and desecrating it, and then setting up the worship of Zeus and the other gods that the Greeks worshipped. That's what this is. And then 32, with flattery he will corrupt those who act wickedly towards the covenant, but the people who know their God will be strong and take action. And so we see Antiochus, you know, made some fine sounding promises in order to entice people to support his policies, but he would be corrupt. The apostate fails. The Jews that were there, that rise up against him. There are some faithful Jews that remain faithful. There were some dirty Jews too at this time, some apostates, but there's a faithful few, and you can read about them in the Maccabees. But they speak up, and many in Israel stood firm and were resolved in their hearts not to eat unclean foods that he had presented. They chose rather to die than to defile themselves with the food or any of the other things that he wanted them to do. In verse 33 it says, "Those who have insight among the people give understanding to many, yet they will fall by the sword and flame, and they'll be captured and plundered for a time." That's the people of Israel at this time. Just just the way Antiochus treats them. And then when they fall, verse 34, they will be helped by some, but many others will join them insincerely. Meaning, there is really not a lot of trust. They're insincere when they're in need, and people are not helping them. Uh, you know, it's the purity of the oppression. The faithful ones to God receive little help, and presumably an allusion to the small number of forces who at first thought, that first fought against Antiochus. Apparently refers to, them, and then the rest of the verses refer to the fact that the strength of the Maccabean revolt grows and grows. and many of the uncommitted Jews sided with the rebels out of expediency. They hated him and they needed him gone. Verse 35, some of those who have insight will fall, so that they may be refined, purified, and cleansed until the time of the end, for it will come at the appointed time. You know, you see during the oppression, those faithful to Yahweh we talked about are helping, and then, some of the wise will stumble as well. They express the same thought, and for what we saw in 33, true believers are going to suffer persecution and even martyrdom for their faith. Antiochus was horrible. And that's all this sets up. It sets up this entire stage. But now, verse 36, we need to stop thinking about Antiochus in verse 36 and start thinking about the future. And we're going to get into the future events here. Because when you look at verse 36 on, it really refers to the end times. Because you see it right here, until the time of the end. And then you'll see it again in verse 40, at the time of the end. So it almost as if Antiochus is done, because verse 36 all the way down, people will try to make it look like Antiochus, make it sound like Antiochus is part of it. But in the truth of the matter, when you really get to this point, 36 on, it can't be Antiochus like we've been studying, or the same Antiochus. It can't be him, because of the fulfillments here are just not fulfilled with him. And so we can look at it and see it and discuss it as well. So let's see in verse 36. Let's really get to this. The king will do whatever he wants. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and he will say outrageous things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, because he has been decreed, because what he has been decreed will be accomplished. So let's look at it. Let's look at verse 36. And just unravel it. So the king will do whatever he wants. That means at this point he's in power and control. It says that he's going to exalt himself up, speaking of the Antichrist, magnify himself above every god. That means he's going to become the God that people worship, the God of this earth that people are going to worship. And he will say outrageous stuff, crazy stuff against God himself and against all these other gods. He's going to make himself set up as God. And it says that he'll be successful until the time of wrath is completed. That means for a period of, what did we say? 7 years. Remember the last 7 years, that's where this kicks in. When that period of 7 years is finally completed, that's when he will cease being successful. But for 7 years, the time of wrath is completed, he will be successful. It says, because what he has been decreed will be accomplished. What has been decreed will be accomplished because God has declared it. That's basically what it's saying. God has declared it. It will be accomplished. It will happen as God says it will happen, because God decrees it. All right, verse 37. He will not show regard for their gods of his ancestors, For the gods of his ancestors, the God desired by women, or for any other God, because he will magnify himself above all. So he will show no regards for the gods of his ancestors. That means, the past gods that people had worshipped, things that his ancestors might have worshipped. He will not worship them. It says the God desired by women. Most people take that to mean that he will not desire women. That this Antichrist will not have, a desire for a woman in his life for whatever reason, and he will not have any other God. He won't worship him because he will magnify himself above all. I mean, that's the way he thinks. He is God. He's the one above all, is what he's thinking, and he's manifesting himself above all. He'll reject whatever religion is practiced by his ancestors. If this individual, rose from the ancient Rome or whatever family religion, probably, then he will be rejecting that. If it was the Christianity, he's rejecting that. Whatever religion it was, he's rejecting. Like I said, the phrase "one desired by women," it can be interpreted a lot of ways, but a lot of people believe it means the desire for women, or the desire by women, or desire for women. I mean, it can be interpreted so many different ways, but it seems to be that he will not have an appetite for the opposite sex, that he will refrain from women, that he will not, desire a woman. Many successful leaders, you can think about them throughout history, men that were successful had had a weakness for women, ended up crippling their um, reign. Think of Solomon. Think of David. You think of some of the leaders of Rome. They had a desire for women, and they accumulated women and more women and more women, and it was a downfall for or whatever. But this one will not be, um, the best way to say it is distracted by anything. He's not going to be distracted by anything. Instead, it says this is his God. He will honor a God of fortress. That means war. A God his ancestors did not know, with gold, silver, precious stones, or riches. He's not going to worship gods of his ancestors. Instead of those, he's going to honor the God of fortress, this military power and might. It's the personification of war. I mean, he is just all about war. And the thought is that he will regard no other God but only war. And the taking of fortresses, he's going to make those his God, being able to take strongholds, nations. And he will worship this God, this military God, above all the means for gaining world power. It has been observed that if men won't have or will not have the true God, there has to be something to which they'll attach their allegiance to in their heart, and that would be, an, you know, for him, military power. For some people, it could be gold, silver, women. It could be men. It could be a lot of different things, but for him, it is military. He'll honor this God, this military power, by spending lavishly on it with gold, silver, precious stones, costly gifts to increase its size and strength with this army. And for his religion, it seems like he's going to substitute his religion with war. He'll support it with war. He'll fight, and he'll love to fight. Verse 39. He will deal with the strongest fortress with the help of a foreign god. Many believe that to be Satan. He will greatly honor those who acknowledge him in making them rulers over many and distributing land as a reward. This future dictator will attack the mightiest fortresses with the help of Satan himself. That's the foreign god, the one that he's under the influence of. And he will attack with his overwhelming army. The Antichrist is going to destroy all those who dare to challenge him. The peoples of this world that come in conflict with him, he will fight against. He'll make war against. The people of this world will be impressed by his might, and they'll say, "Who is like this beast?" Revelation 13:4. People are going to bow in allegiance or vow allegiance to him as their king, and they'll be rewarded. He will honor them, it says. Grant them positions of leadership. Make them rulers over people. Give them territories to rule. He's paying these people off for liking him. Price of such rewards includes unquestioning allegiance to this man and the government that he's setting up. It could even involve financial or political payoffs. Verse 40. And then as you read this, you see a difference between Antiochus and this guy. Verse 40. At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage in battle. At the time of the end, the wars of the Antichrist are described, as such, and at the time of his conflicts is to be declared the time of the end. Nothing in the context here would restrict the force of the world to end at all. So when we look at it, it must mean the end of all things, possibly. The end battle. More precisely, Armageddon. So at the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle, but the king of the north will storm against him. With chariots, horsemen, and many ships, he will invade countries and sweep through them like a flood. Very similar to our last set of verses about Antiochus. But the wars of the Antichrist are described all the way from here to 45. We're going to see it. But at the time of the conflict, that this is going on, he's going to sweep through them like a flood. He's going to fight as though it is just nothing for him to go through. Kings of the north, chariots, horsemen, many ships. He'll invade countries, sweep through them like a flood. Verse 41. He'll also invade the beautiful land. And that's, Egypt again. Or not Egypt, but Israel again. And many will fall, but these will escape from his power. Edom and Moab, and the prominent people of the Ammonites. He will extend his power against the countries in verse 42. And not even the land of Egypt will escape. So it appears he's going to go from Israel down into Egypt. And it says in verse 43, he will get control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver, over all the riches of Egypt. The Libyans, the Cushites, will also be in submission. Verse 43. Verse 44, but reports from the east and the north will terrify him, and he will go with great fury to annihilate and completely destroy many. And he will pitch his royal tents between the sea and the beautiful holy mountain, that's Moriah, but he will meet his end with no help. And that is in the plain of where the Battle of Armageddon is. And so let's just go through all these verses that I just went through. Let's see, try to get into about 41, and we'll go from there. Invade the beautiful land. Like I said, that is going to be Israel. Many will fall, but he'll escape. And so what appears to happen is that he is going to invade. He's going to go move down into Egypt. But it appears that not all is well with his kingdom and his alliances, because it talks about this king of the north. This king of the north that he hears about, or that he um, knows about, reports from the east and the north. And in some Bible translations, not here, but in other translations, you would see them say Gog and Magog for those. Will terrify him. And so you see him going out to make war with the kings from the north and from the east. That they are coming for him, coming for maybe something he possesses. If he has Israel, one of the things that many people believe could be in need right now is energy or minerals, and the Dead Sea has a lot of geothermal energy built up underneath in the form of steam and other things, but also has many ingredients. One of the greatest ingredients it contains is a substance known as potash, which is used for fertilizers, and it's very well could be that during this time they're going to need fertilization for, to grow crops and stuff like that, especially if you believe in a rapture and things that are going on. And so he's needing these resources. It's been estimated that those resources over there are worth more than almost most of the other resources many countries have, all under just the Dead Sea. So you can see how advantageous it would be for him if he has it, how some other kingdom would come in and try to fight and take it. But it says there's going to be a battle, and ultimately it's going to be God that comes in, but they align in the area of Armageddon. Napoleon just coincidentally has been here and overlooked the valley and area where they believe Armageddon is going to take place. And as he was looking at it, casting his eyes on it, said the armies of the world could maneuver in battle here because of the vastness and ability of it. So it gives you the idea, even in Napoleon's time, he saw that this was an open area that the armies of the world could fight in. And so you see this coming to an end finally in verse 45, and it'll be God that does an end to it. Just going to read something in here, the verses. So when we were in 44, the reports that alarmed the Antichrist evidently are new attacks that have been launched against his interests from nations in the east, north, Gog, Magog, Russia, China, and he doesn't have support from allies to help defend it. Kings of the south, the Arab nations, would not likely venture to attack the Antichrist, but more than likely help him. Kings from the north will go out in rage to destroy and annihilate many, furious anyone who dare to oppose his power. The evil dictator will arrogantly marshal his forces against the enemy with intent of total obliterating them. So you get the idea of the New World Order? Well, if this is prophecy here that's still yet to come, which I believe it is, you see that the one world government might happen for a time, but ends up not staying. It ends up being catastrophe and fighting. And then it ultimately will be God that puts it all to rest. Antichrist will meet those attacking forces in Palestine and make his headquarters between the sea of the beautiful holy mountains. The sea denotes the bodies of water on either side of Israel, the Mediterranean Sea and the Dead Sea on the east. Beautiful holy mountains, Mount Zion, Mount Moriah, that's where the temple stood. The Antichrist will use Jerusalem's temple for his headquarters. And through the brunt of the battle will be elsewhere. Daniel is reporting that the final war will be fought in Israel, a fact set forth in scriptures in Ezekiel 39:2 to 29, so you can go read that later. Joel 3:2 to 16, Zechariah 12:2 to verse 9, and 14 verses 1 to 21. As in Revelation, it indicates more specifically that the valley of Megiddo, or Armageddon, will be the final conflict. Revelation 16:16. And then the career of the most evil man in history gets terminated. Earlier in the book of Daniel, it was revealed that the little horn will be judged when the Lord comes to set up his kingdom. So ultimately, he finds his demise by God, by God himself, as we see in Revelation. But it's just interesting. And you look at this section here, there's just too much of it when you read it that appears to be prophecy other than Antiochus. You know, prophecies like Fortress of Gold, honor a god of fortress, I'm sorry. Well, yeah, that's kind of like Antiochus. But Antiochus didn't abandon his gods of his family. He worshipped them. He worshipped the god of his ancestors. I mean, he had wife and children. He didn't abandon women. And so you look at it, and there's just no way possible, if this is prophecy, and it's 100% true, to be Antiochus Epiphanes. It has to be somebody else. And it is somebody else. It is the Antichrist. So go read through this. Just keep reading through it on your own. Pull out a history book. Pull out a good commentary. New American Commentary is a good one. There's several others that are good as well. And just read along with it, because what you want to get is the history part of it all the way up to verse 36. You want to get the history of what's going on just to see how accurate Daniel is in these predictions that are just 100% accurate, and to a letter of things that happened. I would sit here and say this is more specific about what's going to happen over the period of Daniel's time here to almost the coming of Christ just right before that. The greatest prophetic area in the whole Bible, because of the accuracy and the detail with which it gives. And then we can take all this prophecy, use it to put faith in prophecy that has not been fulfilled yet. Verse 36 all the way down to verse 45. We can use it there and understand and know that God's going to have this accomplished because it's his will, his desire, and that he is going to be determined to make it accomplished. because he decreed it, and it's going to happen just as he said. So, how all this stuff happens, it's very interesting, but we will see this happen one day, and the Battle of Armageddon will take place. And it appears to be that the Battle of Armageddon will be a battle between armies of foreign lands against each other, and ultimately God will be brought in to stop it all and slay them all by the word of the Lord, as you'll see in Revelation. If you ever do a study in Revelation, you see that. It's fascinating. It's just interesting. What I'll do is I will put together, um, what I might do is send out a link on some messages on this particular chapter, um, that can help you out with it. Some sermons. Chuck Swindoll's got some real good ones. I will put a link up to actually his sermon that you guys can listen to that gives in detail more 36 to 43 or 45, I'm sorry, on it as well. So hope you guys have a great night. I hope to see you guys, um, on Sunday. We love you, and we'll be praying for you. Let's close in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for all that you've done, and Father, while this is prophecy and it's sometimes difficult for us to interpret, pray, Father, that you'll give us a listening ear and that we will understand it, that we can see it, and that you'll make it known to us. Whether it's talking about the Greeks or the Romans that came in after them very briefly here, or even so far as to the Antichrist that we saw. Just ask and you pray that you'll be with us. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, have a great day, guys.